Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar from Analysis to Action, RSB's PtX Fuel Policy Brief for Australian Decision Makers. I'm Georgina Shriya, the Marketing and Events Manager for Bioenergy Australia. Bioenergy Australia is the national industry body dedicated to accelerating Australia's bioeconomy. Through our work, we are committed to advocating for supportive policy and market mechanisms to drive the development of Australia's low-carbon liquid fuels and renewable natural gas sectors. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Yagara and Turrbal people, the traditional custodians of the land which I'm speaking from today. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which our attendees are connecting from and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. So a few housekeeping items to get us started. So make sure you introduce yourself and where you are watching from in the chat box. Use the Q&A box for any questions for our speakers. And a note that today's session is being recorded and will be shared with all registered attendees and also put on our YouTube channel. So thanks for joining us live. So what does it take to design Australia's SAF and Power-to-X fuel policy built for scale? Today, we are very pleased to hold this webinar with RSB, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, a global non-profit organisation working to advance the just transition to a sustainable bioeconomy. Today's session will present key finding on RSB's new policy brief for Australia, developed to inform policymakers, industry stakeholders, and others engaged in the development of SAF strategies. The presentation will be followed by a short panel discussion as we bring together perspectives from OEMs and industry stakeholders with Stephen Forshaw from Airbus and Liam Reid from HIF Global. The webinar will conclude with an audience Q&A with our speakers, so please do take the opportunity to ask questions in the Q&A box throughout the session and be part of the conversation. So to kick things off, we are joined by Hester Hegel to take us through the findings from the policy brief. Esther is RSB's Technical Associate Director. She leads and supports technical cross-team efforts to expand the impact of RSB's sustainability framework across the chemicals, materials and PtX sectors, advancing solutions that minimise greenhouse gas emissions, uphold social responsibility, maximise resource efficiency and ensure economic viability. Welcome, Esther.
Great. Thank you so much, Georgie. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Greetings from Frankfurt. So I also welcome you to our webinar today from Analysis to Action, RSB's PtX Fuel Policy Brief for Australian Decision Makers. And thank you so much to Bioenergy Australia for co-hosting this webinar. We already covered the housekeeping rules, so just a reminder also that we will record the meeting. And please put your questions in the chat box and the Q&A box so we can have an open discussion at the end. As Georgie already introduced, we will have three main parts today. So I will start by giving you insights or sharing insights from our recent policy brief, which will take about 15-20 minutes. And then I'm very pleased to be moderating a short expert discussion with Stephen and Liam. And then we also allocated around 50 minutes to actually answer your questions. So please, again, share them with us. And then at the end, Bioenergy Australia will close. So for those who may be less familiar with RSB, we are the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, a global network aiming to accelerate the just and sustainable transitions to a circular and bio-based economy. Our work focuses on ensuring that the transition to sustainable fuels and materials is not only about reducing emissions, but also about delivering credible environmental, social, and economic outcomes across the value chain. So how do we want to ensure these positive outcomes? So here you can see RSB's 12 principles and criteria, and they are the foundation of all our work and guide the development of our standards, certification frameworks, and reports. So while GHG emission reductions are essential, they are only one dimension of sustainability. And our framework really takes a broader view, addressing issues such as biodiversity protection, water stewardship, human and labor rights, but also land rights, food security, and rural development across the full supply chain. One of our strengths is that we bring together stakeholders from across the entire value chain. So our members include airlines, fuel producers, technology developers, feedstock suppliers, certification bodies, but also social and environmental NGOs, researchers, but also consumer-facing brands. And what makes this particularly valuable for topics such as SAF and PtX fuels is that we can facilitate conversations across all of those different viewpoints and sectors that normally not always interact, and help to identify practical solutions that are both implementable from the industrial point of view, but also credible from a sustainability perspective. I also want to briefly highlight the scale of our work. So we've been operating as a non-profit organization registered in Switzerland since more than a decade, and today work with more than 150 members globally. RSB is also a sustainability certification framework and a multi-stakeholder membership platform. So you might know that our certification scheme is recognized under ICAO CORSIA, but also by the European Commission to certify different types of fuels and application. But we're also running a voluntary certification system globally for credible sustainable claims. And today we have certified operations across 38 countries and have helped avoid more than 4 million tons of GHG emissions. And the last point, we also operate our own SAF book and claim registry. And you can see in the bottom right that more than 1,000 TEECs, so tradable instruments for environmental claims, have been issued. And this demonstrates the growing interest also in credible SAF claims that can increase and the increasing maturity of these markets. So with this background, I would now like to turn the focus of today's webinar, which is the presentation of our recent launch policy brief called Powering Aviation Resilience, Key Findings for the PtX Fuel Policy Brief for Australia. The policy briefing I'm presenting today builds on a larger regional study that we published at the end of last year. And in that work, we developed a roadmap to analyze the role of PtX fuels in aviation decarbonization across the Asia-Pacific region to help guide industries, investors, and policymakers as these pathways continue to evolve. And then building on those insights, we developed a dedicated high-level policy brief for Australia, which was launched just last week and which I'm very pleased to be presenting and discussing with all of you today. So both applications were developed through our multi-stakeholder approach. So we created expert groups, we did expert stakeholder interviews and engagements, and two of the experts you will hear from today as well. And together, they moved the conversation from regional analysis towards practical policy choices and implementation in Australia. And you can download both briefings for free on our website. So over the next few minutes, you see I put up a quite ambitious agenda. I want to walk you through some of the main findings and recommendations. I will not be able to go into every detail, but I selected some key topics that I will walk you through. And I will then compile or close with 5 considerations for policymakers, and then also drawing on all of these 7 recommendations before we move into the expert question discussion. So first, why SAF matters for Australia. So there are 3 main reasons why SAF matters so much for Australia. So first is aviation decarbonization. Sustainable aviation fuels are widely recognized as the primary option for reducing aviation emissions over the coming decade, particularly for long-haul and regional travel using existing aircraft and fuel infrastructure. The second point is fuel security. As you all know, Australia remains heavily reliant on imported jet fuel and is exposed to global supply disruptions and fuel price volatility. And as aviation demand continues to grow across the Asia-Pacific region, developing domestic SAF production can really strengthen resilience and also improve long-term fuel security, which also leads to the last point, the third one, which is economic opportunity. So our global study, but also the regional one, showed that Australia has exceptional potential to build out renewable energy. It has a high biomass potential and industrial infrastructure. And if these assets are coordinated effectively, Australia could not only meet part of its own future fuel demand, but also emerge as a global competitive producer of SAF and future PtX fuels. So this is really not just a climate discussion, it's also a discussion about energy resilience, industrial development, and Australia's role in future international aviation fuel markets. Before moving into the policy discussion, it's important to recognize that there are many different pathways to produce SAF. They're all built on different feedstocks and technologies. And here on the left side, you just see some examples of feedstocks and pathway families, and there are many, many more. And it's very important to acknowledge that we will need all of them. So while bio-based pathways will be more critical in the near-term deployment, because they're available today and can help build the markets, build infrastructure, and build supply chains, we also know that sustainable biomass resources are finite. And as demand for sustainable aviation fuels grows, we'll also need more future pathways, such as PtX fuels and other pathways that will become increasingly important to deliver the long-term scale and also deep emission reduction that we need for aviation. Before going deep into PtX fuels, I wanted to share our definition. So there is no harmonized definition of all those pathways. And for our studies, what we called PtX fuels are aviation fuels that are produced using hydrogen that's coming from renewable electricity. So we distinguish two types of fuels in our studies. The first is called power-to-liquid or PtL fuels. And for those fuels, the renewable hydrogen is combined with carbon to produce synthetic fuels. And then there's power biomass to liquid, PBTL fuels, where hydrogen is used to enhance biomass conversion pathways and increase sustainable fuel yields. Also, one thing to highlight is that RSB we are not about identifying winning pathway. We are deliberately pathway agnostic. So we're supporting the scale up of all pathways, and our role is more to create the conditions that allow those different pathways to scale and support near-term and long-term deployment over time. And the study today was particularly focusing on this one type of fuels, which doesn't mean that this is a type of fuel that RSB supports specifically. Great. This brings us to one of the central messages of the brief. SAF and PtX deployment is not determined by feedstock availability alone. So on the left side, you can see some of the key system conditions that need to align. And as already shared, for PtX fuels, particularly, you will need a lot of renewable electricity to produce the hydrogen. And hydrogen is really a critical feedstock, as you heard, for those pathways we're looking at. But also carbon sourcing will influence whether the fuels can be produced and also if they meet global sustainability and market requirements. Then biomass remains important for near-term SAF deployment, while infrastructure, certification, and policy all influence whether projects can actually move forward. So the high-level map on the right side illustrates this challenge. So it shows that SAF and PtX projects tend to emerge where multiple of those enabling conditions come together, such as access for renewable resources, biomass, carbon sources, infrastructure, but also water that is needed to produce the fuels and industrial hubs. So projects do not appear simply because there's one single resource available, but it's about an entire system that aligns. This means that when we talk about SAF policy, we're not only talking about fuel production, we're talking about energy policy, hydrogen development, carbon management, infrastructure planning, sustainability governance, and aviation policy all working together. And that is why the brief frames SAF and PtX deployment as a system coordination challenge, because success will really depend less on any single resource, a single policy instrument, but more how effectively these different system elements are connected and developed over time. Then next, I wanted to share some insights from global policy lessons for scaling PtX fuels. So the question is, what can Australia learn from other jurisdictions? So as you know, there are already developments in the European Union, but also United Kingdom, the US, and otherwhere, and they're quite actually consistent in what they show. And they show that there's no single instrument that is the golden key that delivered large-scale PtX deployment. So we see that stronger development occurs when multiple elements work together. So on the right side, we clustered some high-level elements, which are around creating demand signals. So this could be mandates, targets, or offtakes. Then the second one is financial and price support to bridge the early cost gaps. The third one is to share risks, so capital de-risking, long-term offtake agreements, revenue certainty. Then the fourth one is those enabling systems, so really looking at enabling electricity, hydrogen, carbon infrastructure. And the last but not least one are clear rules. So here it's about eligibility and also sustainability clarity. So one important design lesson from the global landscape is that those eligibility rules are really key. And specifically for electricity, they really shape if fuels can be invested on or not. So they have to be designed carefully. So unclear or changing rules increase project risks, while weaker rules, of course, can undermine market confidence. Then, so looking at everything that's said, we came up with some high-level demand-side policy design recommendations. So here also on the right side, we shared 5 observations for considerations. So one is eligibility criteria. So it's important that you define eligible pathways and sustain conditions very clearly. The second is about carbon intensity, so using CI metrics within broader safeguards and not in isolation. And then the third one, it's about certification and data. So this is also where RSB plays a role. So it's really about recognizing existing and global schemes and also data sources to reduce parallel compliance issues for producers. The fourth point is land use risk. So it's very important that you also manage risk of indirect land use change and land use change with context-specific safeguards. And for example, CSR already developed some quite nice criteria for Australia on this. And the last point is interoperability. So it's very important that systems are transparent and that they can interlink to existing claims and also policy tools. And in the ideal world, if this all comes together, your outcome would be predictability, trust, and market access. However, one last recommendation on the left side, it's also okay to be open to evolve, or you actually need designs to evolve over time. So you don't have to start with the perfect design, but you need to allow learnings and technologies and data markets that mature over time and that help you improve your framework. I think that's also what we're seeing in Europe those days quite a lot. Great. So pulling everything together, the briefing identified 5 key considerations. The first one, as said, SAF is not only a climate issue, it's really a strategic issue linked to fuel security and competitiveness. The second is that you need to look at complementary pathways. So both bio-based and PtX fuels should be viewed as complementary pathways for SAF production. The third one is successful deployment depends on policy packages rather than an individual policy signal. The fourth one is that sustainability increasingly determines market access, making certification part of the market infrastructure. And the last one, where I had not so much time to talk about today, it's about mechanisms such as book and claim that could help build demand and investment during the early stages of market development. And with those 5 considerations, we then developed our recommendations, which are coming up next. So first set of recommendations focuses on coordination and long-term transition planning. So the first one is to treat SAF and PtX deployment as a cross-portfolio priority. So the reality is that SAF is not just an aviation issue. It really sits at the intersection, as said, of energy, industry, infrastructure, climate, and transport. And investors need certainty across all of these areas in the perfect case. So fragmented policy approaches can quickly become a barrier to deployment. The second recommendation is to actively manage the transition between today's SAF solutions and tomorrow's, with, again, bio-based SAF essential for near-term deployment and emission reduction, but at the same time, Australia should avoid creating policy frameworks that unintentionally limit the future growth of other fuels, such as PtX fuels. So it's not about choosing between SAF pathways, but the objective is to create a transition pathways where near-term deployment and long-term scale can develop together. Then the next question would be, how do we create the condition for investment? So the second recommendations are where we see some of the most important lessons also from the global experience. So the third recommendation is to use those global policy learnings to design policy packages rather than relying on single instruments. The fourth one is to design demand-side SAF frameworks that support scale by preserving long-term integrity. And the fifth one is to define sustainability and eligibility requirements clearly and early that are particularly around renewable electricity and carbon sources, and also aligned with global existing schemes such as CORSIA or ERED. And then the last bucket, it's about trusted infrastructure or market infrastructure. So the sixth recommendation is to treat sustainability certification and traceability as a market instrument. So when people hear infrastructure, they often think about ports, pipelines, or production facilities, but sustainable fuels markets also depend on systems that verify the claims, that really demonstrate compliance and provide confidence to buyers and investors and regulators. And increasingly, certification is becoming essential for this international market access. And the seventh recommendation is to enable high integrity book and claim systems as a complementary market building mechanisms. So book and claim, while it's not a substitute for physical fuel deployment, however, when it's governed robustly, it can really help aggregate demand and support investment decisions and accelerate market development during this transition phase. Okay, so those were, in a nutshell, the main findings and recommendations from the brief. I appreciate it's a lot to take over a relatively short amount of time, so thank you for your attention. The good news is that we've only touched on the highlights today, and the brief goes a bit deeper. So I really recommend to all of you to download it and also to reach out now or also later with questions. And really hope that the brief can support the ongoing discussions and also decision making, and that can provide a useful resource as Australia continues to shape its SAF and PtX fuel strategy. So this brings us to the more interactive part, our expert discussion. And I'm very pleased to be joined by Stephen Forshaw from Airbus and Liam Reid from HIF Global. And we'll now move from the policy analysis to the practical questions of what this really means for industry, investment, and Australia's global positioning. So we drafted 5 expert discussions. So we have about 50 minutes with Q&A, and then we will open the floor to our audience. So my first question, starting with Stephen and then followed by Liam, could you briefly introduce yourself, your organization, and share a bit why SAF and PtX fuels have become such an important part of your work and long-term strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Esther. Thanks for a really interesting presentation. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Forshaw. I'm the Chief Representative for Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific for Airbus, one of the world's largest aviation manufacturers, as most of you will know. We're also an organisation very committed to helping the users of our aircraft decarbonise their operations. It's super important to us that we're making new and improved, cleaner aircraft. Each generation tends to be far more fuel efficient than the ones before. But the big change, the big quantum change that we need in aviation to help aviation users, airlines and operators decarbonise is going to be through the use of sustainable fuels. Now, biofuels, we all know, and I think in Australia we've had a very active conversation around biofuels for some time now. We're making some progress on the policy settings to start developing SAF production in Australia. We're moving a little slower than I'd like, but we're moving in the right direction. The real big opportunity over the very long term is going to be PtX. And at Airbus, we're very focused on the different pathways to develop different production techniques to develop SAF. I think there is a rich opportunity for Australia to be a mega power when it comes to the production of PtX-based synthetic fuels for aviation and other industries. We have the opportunity to seize here if we are prepared to make early investments today with a full understanding and a realization that this will take quite some time. It will not be, not that biofuels are easy or simple, but the pathway to PtX is going to be a longer and more sophisticated one, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It means we actually should start with the investments today to help build our capabilities in this particularly interesting pathway, because I think it has a lot to offer for Australia.
Great. Thank you so much for those introductions. So Liam, over to you. Same question. Please introduce yourself, organization, and your work on SAF and PtX fuels. You're still mute, Liam.
Is
Now,
that better?
great.
Yeah, excellent.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Esther, and thanks, Stephen, for those insights. I'm Liam Reed. I'm Chief Commercial Officer at HIF Global. It's APAC Group, and answering that question about SAF and PtX as a strategic priority for HIF is very much grounded in just our origin story, where our CEO, Cesar Norton, was down the southern tip of Chile, and just witnessed just how incredible the winds were down in the Haruani region. Thought it would be great to find a way to take this incredible energy resource, which is stranded really, and convert it into a transport fuel, something could be used elsewhere. So a few years later, we've got a full-sized wind turbine and a small pilot plant taking biogenic carbon dioxide from a not too far away brewery electrolyzer, and ultimately creating 10 to 20,000 liters of e-gasoline via a methanol pathway. And the potential to do SAF, we use that to support, in fact, Porsche's racing fleet. That it's shipped over literally to Germany as a proof of concept, and now we're deploying developing of e-fuel and PtX projects globally, particularly across Latin America, and in Northwest Tasmania is a significant project for us. So it's a strategic priority, and that's really what the business was set up to do. We saw the demand and the opportunities coming from Europe, and I guess, Esther, we could talk a lot about the importance of that infrastructure and those standards that you're talking about. And yes, we're also looking at projects throughout the rest of the APAC region, and China all the way to India via Vietnam. Certainly, there's a lot of great work going on and amazing opportunities and different ways of combining those systems that you mentioned. That ecosystem of being able to find a decent port to be able to export the fuels, rich sources of biomass, and globally cost competitive electricity.
Great. Thank you both for the introduction. So the next follow-up question. And I think, Stephen, you called it mega power, and also our policy brief argues that Australia has exceptional potential to become a leading producer of sustainable aviation fuels and also PtX fuels. So from your perspective, what is the biggest opportunity and what is the biggest challenge for Australia today?
Yeah, so look, I'd answer it this way. We are spending a lot of time as an industry having the conversation rightly about the urgency of moving to produce more fuels here in Australia for essentially three reasons. One, to improve our sovereign security, our fuel security position, to move ourselves away from 91% or so of our aviation fuel being imported. We have the opportunity to make fuel in Australia from things above the ground instead of below the ground, coming from the other side of the planet. Second is the enormous economic opportunity it opens up to produce these fuels, particularly in regional Australia. And third is the decarbonisation benefit that accrues from the transition. And it is a transition because these are drop-in fuels. You can replace almost litre by litre and effectively be able to decarbonise incrementally and eventually at scale. That's great. But we also have to recognise that in the long term, and by long term, I'm now talking decades out, there are going to be limitations on our ability to make as much biofuels as we're going to need, because in order to decarbonise all of our transport sectors, aviation, shipping, and heavy road transport, to the extent that that's not electrified, we are going to need different pathways to make new types of fuel. And so I've always been interested in the PtX conversation. It's not necessarily going to solve our decarbonisation problem today, and certainly at the cost of production today, PtX is not going to be the first point of call. But it is going to be a potential answer to that very long-term question about how do we move to the global scale required. We're a nation that uses nearly 10 billion litres of aviation fuel a year. We are in the top 8 countries in the world for our use of aviation fuel. Biofuels will help as a transition pathway, and it'll be a big transition pathway, granted. But in the long term, we're going to really need to move into these new technology pathways. They are expensive. They require a lot more research and development, but I'm fundamentally very optimistic about every form of energy transition we've seen to date has come down significantly on the cost curve. The more scale is introduced, the more research and development is done, and the more we open up the opportunity. I'd like to see Australia seize that opportunity. We have the opportunity to do this here because of the ability we have to produce the green hydrogen at scale. Yes, it will be a challenge to find the clean electricity we're going to need, but those challenges have solutions. We have access to huge amounts of renewable electricity in Australia, and there are potentially a lot of pathways we can open up to generate more and more electricity to help make synthetic fuels. I'd like to see us play a role because I can see the day coming where we could effectively be the Saudi Arabia of synthetic fuels and have that opportunity grow here in Australia. It does require us starting to have conversations about it now. I'm not suggesting for a moment that that opportunity should come at the expense of or in place of the important work that's being done to develop biofuels. But I am saying this report from RSB gives us a bit of an opportunity to have a conversation about what comes next. And we should be ready as a country to start thinking about the pathway for this transition being a 30 to 50 year window, not just a 3 to 5 year window.
Thank you, Stephen. And Liam, what's your response to this question? So biggest opportunities and challenges for Australia?
I think it's a great follow-on from Stephen's point about this being a longer-term game. But even in the shorter term, Australia, and particularly Tasmania, actually has a abundant green-only grid, or abundant by definitions to the European standards. We might talk about that in a moment. But it's got a certifiable green grid with well over 90% renewables. So being able to develop these sorts of globally certifiable PtX fuels can be done in the here and now more cheaply than many other countries that don't have the kind of renewable penetration that Tasmania does, and increasingly South Australia, I would say, by 2030. I mean, it takes 3 to 5 years to build a methanol SAF plant. By the time that is actually fully done, South Australia could well be a renewable grid. So the opportunities here in the north in the short term as well as the longer term.
Thank you. And actually, this fits nicely into the next question. So one key message of our brief is that resource potential alone does not deliver projects. So what should policymakers prioritize over the next 5 years to turn Australia's potential into real investment, production, and fuel uptake? Stephen, you want to start?
So look, I think it's probably going to start with small bites of the pie here. We need to continue the R&D focus on the different PtX pathways. I would say that in doing this, there are a lot of challenges. I see a couple of them in the Q&A chat function already. How, for example, do we decide the best use of electricity and carbon involved in creating? We've got lots of other things to balance against. And I think all of these are good questions. And I don't know that any of us have the answers today. But I guess my perspective on this is that I don't want us to sit on our hands and let others around the world solve the problem and we miss the opportunity. Unfortunately, we're pretty good at that here. We have a very good track record in Australia of pulling things out of the ground, putting them on ships and sending them offshore for people to value add in the processing. And I really feel very strongly that I want our research community to be part of looking at how we do this. starting to tackle those really hard questions. We have an outstanding science and research community in this country that I don't think we pay enough attention to. The CSIRO is probably one of the world's most renowned science and industrial research organisations. And, you know, don't lose focus on the industrial research that the organisation does. Our universities are top draw anywhere in the world when it comes to research. Let's apply them at scale to these challenges and accept that, yeah, we don't have answers to all of these questions today, but isn't it worth us spending some time alongside our international research partners, not necessarily in competition with, but alongside our partners, to try and identify, you know, how we can scale these projects. Start small, do some pilots, learn some lessons, apply some of the cost savings that are going to come with better research, better technology, and improved development. And most importantly, as we learn those lessons, then let's begin applying them here so that we can take the opportunities to grow the space here in Australia.
Great, thank you for those recommendations. Liam, what's your take on this?
I think very similar, but perhaps instead of, as well as a strong research base, and being able to start small. It's about finding demand. This probably bleeds into the next question as well, but being able to find opportunities to supply in Australia, find customers willing to fund the production of these PtX pathways in a way which is investable. So that might just be just literally be a contract. Finding commercial customers to be able to do that. It's very hard. Most people who are looking for fuel are looking for a least cost option. That this fits within their legal requirements, right? So yeah, I think that's probably the most important action is create a pathway where you've got demand to be able to develop the SAF and PtX.
Great. I think that nicely links to our expert question for you, Liam, and it's a question we also received from the registration. So what is the biggest barrier preventing project actually reaching this FID and commercial deployment in Australia?
I think the focus is in Australia, because Australia is already doing a really good job, in its product go legislation that it's been putting together about trying to align with global, particularly European Renewable Energy Directive for RFNBOs. We haven't really talked about that, but being able to create e-fuels and these PtX fuels needs to really come from a standard, and the most well-developed standard is the European one. So Australia already has that. I don't think it's so much of a barrier if we're looking to export these fuels eventually. Finding a way to mandate, I guess that's a word, but I would just say find a demand for these e-fuels at home first. Allow yourselves to build at scale, small scale, and then build the learnings in and create the export powerhouse that Australia has. In terms of the biomass, being able to source it, it's certainly a challenge. It's infamous, really. If you want to get large amounts of agro waste, being able to bring it to a centralized point for processing to ultimately be converted into carbon dioxide as a feedstock for your fuels. This is something which Australia has lots of the feedstock, but being able to centralize it and create systems to put it together. Those are the kinds of learnings that we'll be able to do as well, if not better than anyone, just because of the sheer amounts of land that we use for broad scale cropping or forestry. So those supply chains are an important thing I think we can develop further. But yeah, probably the biggest barrier is finding an off-taker. At the moment, Australia and Germany is putting together a notable H2 global project where an intermediary would come in and stand in front of small to short-term buyers in Germany that have to buy these green fuels from 2030. It's a nice start, but I think being able to do that for a domestic arrangement here in Sydney, here in Australia, not Sydney, would be even more valuable for us.
Okay, really interesting. Stephen, Airbus has consistently highlighted the importance of global market access and international alignment. How should Australia position itself within global SAF certification and sustainability frameworks to remain internationally competitive?
Yeah, look, this is always going to be an interesting question, and this is not in any way just linked to PtX. This is going to apply to biofuel-based SAF and other forms of low-carbon liquid fuels. I would say that we must resist the temptation in Australia to go down a path of developing our own standards and our own frameworks and very much be part of the global community here. There are existing schemes, Corsia in relation to the feedstocks, ASTM in relation to the technology pathways. I accept that neither of those schemes may be seen as perfect. I don't know that there's any multilateral scheme or certification regime worldwide that is perfect, but I think they are the most important frameworks that we must work within, because aviation in particular is a global industry. We have global standards in nearly everything we do in aviation, and what we've found is that it makes the business of aviation harder for the airlines when you start introducing individual national standards. The EU has gone down a pathway, for example, on delay compensation, which has made it very expensive for airlines to operate. There are some elements of that scheme that I get have been put into place because of they're dealing with a constant customer frustration. But I really think that, the lesson in what we're doing in Australia is avoid going down the path of individual jurisdiction by jurisdiction certification schemes and work together on improving the frameworks so that they are more effective, that if there are pain points or if there are individual factors for Australia, for example, some of our unique feedstocks that haven't been foreseen in the development of international frameworks, well, we have to work within the organisations to be able to make our voice heard. And I think Australia has a really good track record of being able to do that. So I think the key point here is make sure that we are part of the global community, that we're influencing those decisions and have a seat at the table, so that where there are those pain points, we deal with them as part of a constructive dialogue with the community of nations. Because at the end of the day, our customers, the airlines who buy the planes that they fly, need to know that they're operating with a as simple as possible regulatory framework, but most importantly, one that's consistent whether they fly in Australia, in Singapore, in the European Union, in the United States, or wherever it may be.
Great, thank you. This brings us to the last question. I asked, please give a short answer because we also want to have some time for the Q&A. So quickly, looking ahead to 2035, what would success look like for Australia in the global SAF and PtX fuel market? Stephen, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so very simply, by 2035, I want to see lots and lots of biofuel-based SAF starting to be produced at our first generation of refineries in Australia. I would like to see some more research and development being done on PtX pathways. I am not expecting that we'll see commercial scale production of PtX by 2035. I would like to see us do more research on it. I'd like to see our research community engaged on it, particularly with international partners. But I'm very realistic that PtX has a much longer horizon than 2035. And I'm saying we shouldn't be afraid of things because they have long horizons.
Thanks. Liam.
Yeah, and I guess there are milestones along the way, aren't there, Stephen? By 2035, we could have made some really substantive progress. And certainly, seeing the Hydrogen Head Start 1 and Hydrogen Head Start 2 projects, full disclosure, HIF has been shortlisted for the second Hydrogen Head Start. But the winners of those projects, plus the winners of the H2 Global Australia Germany opportunities there, should be up and running in full commercial operations by about 2031, 2030, around about there. What would success look like would be the next generation of those projects, having learned as they are building, move towards commercial operation. Yes, that'll probably involve a carbon price or some sort of production tax credit, but it will be that much next generation more efficient and more cost effective. I think that's a fair gauge of success.
Great. Very, very interesting. Perfect. This brings us to the audience Q&A. And to kick off, I just wanted to share a question that we received up front. So I would start with the first one. What is the most important thing for governments to get right if they want to support the establishment of a domestic low-carbon liquid fuel industry? So a bit focusing on Australia. Any take here, any recommendations from one of you?
Maybe let me have a crack at this, because I think I've been on record as saying for a long time we have to have the right mix of supply side support and demand side drivers. You can't have one without the other. We're not the United States with the budget depth that allows us to have an Inflation Reduction Act scale of subsidy scheme for the production of low carbon liquid fuels. I think we need to have the right level of support to get early projects off the ground, get them to viability, to be able to help proponents take FID or final investment decisions on good, sound economic grounds. And that will be balanced by having the right level of demand drivers that perhaps moderately at the start begin to create a market for the fuels that we produce. And if we get the scale right between both, if we learn the lessons, I mean, the one upside of being slightly behind or somewhat behind the rest of the world is so that we can learn the lessons from how they've been applied elsewhere. Learn lessons from the US where it's very supply side focused, learn lessons from the European Union where it's very demand side driven, and apply all of them together in moderation, the best of, and learn from the worst of each of those jurisdictions to apply the right levels of framework across the policy settings.
Yeah, I'd probably add that just if government wants to get it right, they actually have to understand what it is they want. So what it's supporting the establishment of domestic low carbon liquid fuels industry, what does that look like and why are you doing it? I thought, Esther, you made a great point. It's yes, it might be about decarbonizing, of course, but it's also about fuel security and economic opportunities. So, if government's going to get it right, it needs to create those conditions and that come out of them actually creating the right emphasis on those three things, not focusing on just one.
Really agree. Great. Then I would pick a second question that was submitted, which is how should policy around biogenic CO2 be supported to encourage the development of PtX as a crucial feedstock? And maybe I can start giving an answer. So CO2 is one key input for PTL fuels, and I think the answer I would give is, again, looking at alignment with global policies. So CORSIA or ERED, or also our framework, already recognizes different sources of CO2 that are eligible and that should be used to produce those fuels to ensure they're really sustainable in the mid and long term. And to this end, there are three main options given. So often there are some limited or restricted possibilities to use industrial CO2 point sources. Depending on the framework, this is time limited. For other frameworks, it's more open, but it needs to be unavoidable CO2 emissions. Then the second bunch is biogenic CO2. And here, I think it's a very important feedstock for multiple industries. And I think, or I read some studies, and there is also quite some potential in Australia to use this biogenic CO2 that's already coming from different industries, such as fermentation business and others. However, all the studies I've seen so far suggest that there will also be shortage of this biogenic CO2 at some point, just because there's so many sectors that look for this super pure and clean biogenic CO2 to be used for more sustainable production routes. So in the long term, maybe midterm, but rather long term, we will also need to see more direct air capture projects. And I've seen some R&D projects in Australia, but I think it's something that should also come. So here, again, I would also echo what was said before, that policy should really go deeper into R&D or funding R&D around those different sources in Australia to understand how to best support those different pathways, and also building on existing infrastructure. Also knowing that, of course, there's quite some fossil-based CO2 that's out there in Australia that could be repurposed at least for a certain amount of time before those other CO2 sources are available. Anything from you to add, Stephen, Liam, on the CO2 topic?
I mean, recycling CO2 is a lovely idea when it comes from fossils. You know, it's nice in theory, but when you've got a limited amount of time to use it, and you're building a project which might last 10 or 25 years, you've got and potentially that carbon dioxide is no longer available and becomes uneconomic to use another technology. It's pretty hard to invest with anything other than biogenic CO2, to be honest. Even in India, they are co-firing. They're in coal-fired power stations, biogenic biomass to try and get biogenic CO2 as the only I'm going to say export capable CO2 for e-fuels or PtX fuels. And even that, there are investors who are really concerned about using any fossil fuel infrastructure, even if the biomass that's going into the coal boiler is displacing coal. No, sorry. So there's a really interesting policy conversation to have about biogenic CO2 being sort of a premier or gold standard, and understanding just how hard it is to create an investable opportunity using fossil CO2.
Yeah. Maybe just I saw one follow-up message about direct air capture being more a fantasy trap. So I think one thing to add, that what we see, that it's really important to find regional solutions. So every country has different existing industry, existing infrastructure, and feedstock opportunities. So that's why I think more R&D is needed to find the sweet spot for Australia in this case. So should it be, I don't know, certain percentage reusing industrial CO2? What's the percentage of biogenic? Is direct air capture an option or not? Just repeating that, I think for quite some parts of the world, we see there is a big demand and also need for direct air capture for the long term. With this, I would like to move to two questions from the chat here directly. So the first one is about the uncertainty, pathway uncertainty to commercial reality. So there is considerable scientific judgment that suggests it will never be sufficient cost competitive for mainstream situations. So the question is, why should Australia invest and fund this technology? And why not wait to sit on the hands, like Stephen said, to wait that others overseas develop it and then deploy it when tech is commercially mature? Should we focus on near-term deployment options? And Stephen, you want to answer this question.
Yeah, and I think I've covered most of the points in relation to this question already, but I want to challenge this point about why not wait for it to be developed overseas on other people's money. Unfortunately, we have a bit of a track record of that in Australia, where it'll be right, someone else can do it, someone else can do the hard work, and we'll come in and, sort of be the white knight and pick things up when they're ready. It doesn't work like that. I'd really like, as I said earlier, we have some of the best researchers in the world here. I'd like them to be part of this opportunity. And this is not a case of we should do this on other people's money. And I'm also not suggesting we put vast amounts of taxpayers' funds into this. I'm suggesting that through modest research programs where we can play a role in how we can unlock the potential of PtX, Australia can play a major role. we know that we have the natural ingredients and the composition to be able to play that role, and I'd like us to work hard at unlocking that. If it works out that it's not commercially viable, we understand the process here. We're going to be very disciplined in how we do it, but I don't like this assumption that we should just sit back on our hands and let others do this when we have an opportunity to be part of something that could be really, really exciting for our country and growing a huge new opportunity and a new industry for Australia to participate.
I think also you got to understand that Australia may be investing and innovating simply out of necessity. We look at South Australia's renewable energy transformation, where not too long ago it had very, very few solar and wind farms, and had a couple of big, relatively large coal-fired generators and a vibrant gas industry. Those coal generators retired because the coal became much less viable, and out of necessity, South Australia innovated and began to bring in the world's biggest battery at the time, and invested all sorts of things to be able to, like innovations, to be able to create some of the highest. In fact, I think it is the highest sort of penetration amongst anyway in the world for what it is. And is a roadmap. Certainly many of the things that we've seen overseas, the mistakes that, say, the Spanish made not too long ago in a blackout they had, they could very well and should have learned from what we were doing in Australia. So I don't think that it's necessarily something we just have to wait for for international opportunities to develop and go first. We're doing it out of necessity anyway, and for that important fuel security and decarbonization requirements for Australia, we're doing it anyway. So just do it with a plan. Be a lot easier than and more cost effective than doing it without one.
Yep, agree.
Great. Okay, then I would like to close with the last question and ask for a quick answer. So the last one is: a lot of discussion focused on Australia renewable resource potential as a competitive advantage for PtX and SAF. However, many renewable projects still face community resistance and lengthy development timelines. How can the industry better build community support and social license so that renewable electricity development doesn't become a bottleneck? Any thoughts?
I mean, this is a broader question about social license for energy, not just Power-to-X, but understanding and appreciating that the existing system that we use to keep the lights on and make a modern standard of living has to change. We're not going to be, we can't keep these coal-fired power stations going indefinitely. We have to make decisions about shutting them down or building new ones, which is extremely expensive, particularly compared to the cost of renewables and storage that we now are being able to develop, and which has been proven time and time again. So in terms of social license, being able to carefully explain that and share the benefits of those projects and that technology, whether it be to keep people's cooktops going, or to create globally competitive export fuel opportunities for SAF or other fuels. These are fundamental economic drivers for Australia and improves energy security. So I guess that's what I got to say.
Great. So I see there are many more questions coming in. So thank you very much for your interest. Please follow up also via email. And yes, this brings me to some closing remarks. So from my side, before I hand over, thank you all for joining us today. I hope you really enjoyed the discussion. I did. So thanks again also to Stephen and Liam to join us today to share your thoughts. And I hand over to Georgie to close our webinar today.
Thank you, Esther. So yes, thank you everyone for joining us. It brings us to the end of the webinar today. So Thank you for joining live and providing some great questions for discussion. We appreciate the time that you've taken to come and interact with this session today. Make sure you follow us on LinkedIn for the latest news and events. Big thank you to Stephen, Esther and Liam for their preparation and time today in presenting. We really appreciate the opportunity that is given to members to come in and interact with this session. So there will be a short evaluation survey at the end of today's Zoom that will pop up. So please take a few minutes to complete that. It's really helpful for us in planning our future events and education that's relevant to our attendees. And a copy of the recording will be made available and sent out to all of our registrants, and also are made available on YouTube. If you want to rewatch or share with colleagues, then that would be great. So thank you everyone for attending, and we look forward to welcoming you to a Bioenergy Australia event soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.